Crawling from every corner of the world, come the stories that should never be told. Creepy stories from around the world. If you enjoy this video, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It truly helps us make more of this type of content. The 70s were a paradox of time. On one hand, the world beyond the hills seemed to be hurtling forward. Motorways stretched their gray ribbons across England. Young men grew their hair long and wore shirts loud with paisley, and radios spilled the music of the Beatles, T-Rex, and the Stones from nearly every high street. But the countryside itself had hardly changed in centuries. The villages crouched beneath ancient church spires, their cottages glowing with honey-colored limestone, their lanes hemmed in by walls of dry stone that had been laid before the Industrial Revolution had even dreamed of blackening London's sky. Here, milk was still delivered by horse-drawn cart in some parishes, and men still gathered in pubs that smelled of ale and pipe smoke as they had for generations. It was into this world, half modern, half timeless, that the Whitakers came in the summer of 1971. John Whitaker was a man shaped by the soot of Birmingham factories, his hands strong, his back bent by years of graft. Margaret, his wife, was softer, London-born, with eyes that had once dreamed of better things than smoke and narrow brick terraces. They had 3 children, Alice, 12 and sharp as a blade, Stephen, 10, always restless, forever fiddling with his toy cars and matchbox soldiers, and Lily, 7, a dreamer with blonde plaits and a habit of talking to her dolls as though they were alive. They bought the farmhouse near Moreton-in-Marsh for less than they had ever dared to hope. 14 rooms, thick stone walls, beams blackened by centuries of fire. The garden ran to an orchard, untended but still fertile, and a clutch of oaks that clawed close to the upper windows. Yet from the moment they signed the deed, there was unease. When John mentioned the purchase at the pub, conversation died as though someone had thrown a blanket over it. Men stared into their pints, one muttering that the place had been empty near a decade, another, quieter still, saying, "Never could keep a family there." But John, practical and proud, brushed it aside. The 1970s were supposed to be a time of change, of opportunity. They would raise their children in the clean country air, away from factories and coal dust. They would make a life there. The day they arrived was bright, the orchard heavy with the smell of grass and fruit, but already the house showed its teeth. The children ran squealing through rooms that smelled of damp plaster and long-dead fires, finding cupboards that opened into voids, staircases that seemed to lean away from themselves, and a windowless room at the center of the house that was so airless it pressed against the lungs. Margaret stood in the kitchen, charmed for a moment by its vast hearth and oak settle. Yet even as the lavender drifted through the window, she felt a weight in the air, as though the house were not welcoming them, but watching, waiting. At first, the disturbances were small. A broom moved from one end of the scullery to another. The wireless, when tuned to the BBC, hissed with whispers. Chairs were found shifted from the table to the hearth, a trunk in the attic that would not stay shut. Such things could be explained away, and John explained them again and again until his own confidence began to falter. By October, the air inside had grown peculiar. Some rooms stifled with unnatural heat. Others dropped to an icy chill so sharp it sank into the bones. Visitors remarked upon it, shivering in doorways. At night, the Whitakers began to hear noises, deliberate footsteps across the floorboards above, cloth dragging against stone, tapping behind the walls, steady and patient. Then came the whispers, first like conversation overheard through thick plaster, later clearer, a woman's voice, guttural and low, muttering names none of them knew. One night, Lily crept white-faced into her parents' bed, saying someone had whispered her name on the landing. Not called, whispered, drawn out long and thin, like breath forced through teeth. Margaret soothed her, but later that same night, climbing the stairs in silence, she froze midway. The landing stretched black before her, and in that stillness she heard it too, her name, breathed out, elongated, fading into the dark. The violence came next. Margaret's arms bloomed with bruises, fingers pressed deep into her flesh, scratches raked across her back in threes, blood beading at the edges. One evening, as she kneaded dough, she felt 2 hands pressed down hard upon her shoulders, so hard she staggered forward. Alice swore she woke to see a woman hunched at the foot of her bed, her face hidden, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. Lily spoke of worse, a woman with her neck bent at a grotesque angle, crouched in the corner of her room, lips moving silently, watching her with eyes too dark. Margaret tried to comfort her daughter, but that night she herself saw the mattress beside Lily sink down, as though someone unseen were lying in wait. The cellar became a place of dread. The stone steps wept with moisture. The air stank of rot. When its door was left ajar, whispers carried upward, chains dragged across stone, cries muffled by earth. One day, Lily's favorite doll was found shattered at the foot of those steps, its porcelain face in pieces. Finally, John pressed the villagers for truth. Reluctantly, one old farmer spoke. The Godfreys had lived there once, over a century before. Bathilda Godfrey, midwife, healer, and they whispered something darker. She was accused of poisoning mothers, cursing fields, even sacrificing her own child to the devil. Shunned, hated, she was buried in unmarked ground at the orchard's edge. If she despised anything, the farmer said, it was mothers. Reverend Pritchard, the parish priest, came at John's pleading. A gentle man, untested in such things, he carried his Bible and a crucifix into the house. The Whitakers followed as he moved from room to room, his voice low in prayer. But as he reached the master bedroom, the air thickened, pressing against his chest. He whispered, "It clings here, a woman, broken, furious. She feeds on your fear." He cast holy water, lifted the crucifix, spoke words of command. The house answered. Mirrors shattered at once, glass raining like knives across the floor. The girls screamed. Pritchard staggered, blood streaking his face, and his crucifix trembled in his hand. "It is strong," he whispered, horrified. He fled that night, never to return. The Whitakers were abandoned, but word of their plight reached further still. Edward and Clara Sloane heard of it, quietly through Pritchard, who came to them humbled, shaken. Edward was a scholar of such things, a man who gathered old rites and prayers as though building armor. Clara bore a gift, or a curse, that allowed her to sense what others could not. Together they had walked into places where no peace lingered. None had tested them like this. In March of 1972, they arrived. The Cotswolds were greening with spring, daffodils pushing through frost, skylarks singing over fields. Yet when their car turned into the lane, the farmhouse rose like a corpse, refusing the grave, its orchard gnarled, its windows blank. From the moment they stepped inside, Clara pressed her hand to the wall. "She is here," she whispered. Edward set relics in corners, muttering prayers under his breath. The Whitakers, hollow-eyed, clung to hope, and as night fell, the house began to breathe. From the moment the sun fell and the farmhouse sagged into night, Edward and Clara felt the weight of the place more keenly than words could tell. The Whitakers gathered by the kitchen hearth, the only room they dared to use after dark, a single lamp hissing as moths battered its glass. Edward spread his notes across the table, scraps of parchment he had copied from parish records, prayers in Latin and Middle English, diagrams of circles meant to hold back what men had once feared enough to write down. Clara sat opposite him, silent, her fingers wrapped around a teacup she never drank from. It began with footsteps, not the clumsy scurry of children nor the firm tread of a father, but slow, dragging, as if bare feet pressed against the boards above, each step measured. Then came the sound of fabric scraping the stairs, as though someone were being pulled upward, inch by inch. Stephen whimpered. Alice crossed her arms tightly, pretending not to shake. John muttered that the old house groaned in its bones, but he did not meet his wife's eyes when he said it. Clara stood. Without a word, she carried her lamp to the foot of the stairs. The air changed the moment she raised it. The flame bent backward in the drought, though the windows were shut and the light barely reached the first landing. "She waits," Clara whispered, "but she is not bound to one place. She slides like smoke from one room to another, looking, choosing." Edward rose, clutching the small brass crucifix he always carried. His voice was low but firm. "Stay close to the hearth. Do not wander, no matter what you hear." That night, the Sloanes lay in the master bedroom. They had insisted upon it, saying the Whitakers must not suffer another night there. Edward set relics on the mantel, candles of beeswax, a rosary, a small vial of holy water that gleamed faintly in the lamplight. Clara lay awake, her breath shallow, her eyes fixed upon the ceiling. For hours, nothing stirred. Then, just before 3, the smell came. It was faint at first, like damp wood, but soon it thickened into something sour and foul, like meat left to rot beneath hot sun, like earth clotted with blood. Clara gagged. Edward sat bolt upright, his candle flickering though no window was open. Then the whisper. A woman's voice, low, guttural, scraping like iron on stone. Not words at first, just breath. Then syllables. Names. Not theirs, not the Whitakers. Names long buried, strung together in a litany of rage. Clara clutched Edward's hand. He whispered a prayer. The mattress dipped. It was subtle, at first, just enough to shift their weight, as though someone had perched on the edge, then deeper, heavier, until Clara felt the press of a body against her hip, unseen but undeniable. She turned her face, and in the dim orange of the candle, she saw her. Bathilda Godfrey. Her face was gray as ash, skin stretched tight across bone. Her eyes were pits, glistening with black. Her neck bent sharply to one side, the bone protruding at an angle that spoke of a rope's cruel snap. Her lips moved, and though no sound came at first, Clara knew she spoke to her. Not to Edward, not to the Whitakers, to her. Clara gasped, and the vision vanished, but the stink remained, thick and cloying, lingering like a wound. The next morning, the children would not leave the kitchen. Margaret wept softly, her eyes hollow, her hands trembling too much to butter bread. John tried to speak of leaving, of abandoning the farmhouse, but the cost of their move had stripped them bare. They had nothing else, nowhere to go. Edward and Clara did not press them. They simply worked. Daylight gave no safety, only pause. Edward searched parish records at St. David's, tracing every mention of Bathilda Godfrey. He found accounts written in 1862 of infants dead within days of birth, of mothers wasting to skin and bone after childbirth, of crops withering overnight. He found testimony, faded but unmistakable, that Bathilda had been seen in the orchard cradling a bundle, red cloth dark with wetness, singing a lullaby while the moon rose. That was the night, the record said, when her husband hanged himself in the barn and the village dug her grave at the edge of her own field. Unmarked. Shunned. Clara, meanwhile, lingered in the house. She sat with the children, drawing their words out gently, listening to what they had seen. She walked the rooms alone, her palms brushing the stone, her breath shallow. She whispered sometimes, not to herself but to the air, as though half of her was already in conversation with the dead. The manifestations grew bolder. Doors slammed, dishes shattered. Once, a chair skidded violently across the kitchen, nearly striking Stephen. Another night, Margaret was dragged from her bed, bruises blooming across her ankles where invisible fingers had clamped. The cellar door banged open, chains rattling in the depths, though no chain had been left there in living memory. And always, the voice, the whisper that grew louder, clearer, sometimes in the orchard, sometimes on the stairs, sometimes inches from a child's ear. By the third week, Clara was gaunt, her skin pale, her eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. She had begun to dream, every night, of the orchard, of Bathilda waiting there, her broken neck bent, her hands outstretched not in welcome but in accusation. She told Edward in hushed tones, "She does not want to leave. She wants me. She has chosen." Edward's hands shook as he set his candles, his chalk, his books. He tried to steady his voice when he prayed, but in his heart he knew. The farmhouse was no longer just a battlefield. It was a trap, and Bathilda Godfrey had already marked her prey. The final night began with silence, and that was the worst of all. No footsteps, no whispers, no rattling chains, only the oppressive hush of a house holding its breath. The Whitakers huddled in the kitchen, oil lamp sputtering, their children wrapped in blankets, eyes too wide for sleep. John spoke little now. Margaret looked years older, her face sunken, her lips cracked from praying under her breath until they bled. Edward spread his chalk in a circle on the attic floor. Candles ringed its edge, guttering in the damp draft that seeped through the beams. He carried with him a crucifix, his battered notebooks, a relic bound in iron that he had never before dared to use. He told Clara to stay by his side, his voice brittle. She only touched his hand and smiled faintly, as though she had already made peace with something he could not. At midnight, the house began to breathe again. Not with the creak of timbers or the sigh of wind through cracks, but with a low pulse that shuddered through the walls themselves. like the heartbeat of something buried deep. The Whitakers clutched each other tighter downstairs, their lamp hissing. In the attic, the air soured. The smell rolled in thick and cloying. Blood, mildew, and earth. Edward whispered his prayers, words old as the stones beneath their feet. The candles flared high, then bent inward. Flames sucked toward the circle as if by some unseen mouth. Clara stood at the center, her face pale, her eyes shut. She whispered back into the dark, not words Edward knew, but words that seemed older than scripture. And then Bathilda came. Not a glimpse this time, not a shadow at the edge of vision. She rose in full, a blackened figure from the far corner of the attic, her body jerking as though pulled by strings, her neck snapping again and again at impossible angles. Her mouth yawned wide, teeth black, tongue swollen, and she screamed. The sound was not human. It was the scream of every mother who had lost a child, twisted into rage and grief until it no longer resembled sorrow but hunger. The walls shuddered. Dust rained from the rafters. Edward raised the crucifix, his voice breaking with the force of his prayer. Bathilda staggered back, her form flickering like a flame. For a moment, Edward dared to believe, but then her eyes, bottomless, black as grave water, fixed not on him, but on Clara. Clara stepped forward, the chalk circle split beneath her feet, the line crumbling. Edward shouted, reaching for her hand, but she did not turn. "She wants me," Clara said softly, and then louder, her voice cutting through the roar of Bathilda's scream. "She will have no one else." The candles burst as though struck by wind. Darkness swallowed the room, pierced only by the pallid glow that bled from Bathilda's form. Clara raised her arms, her body convulsing, her voice no longer her own, but a chant torn from the depths of time. Edward fell to his knees, pleading, calling her name again and again. Bathilda shrieked, her body splitting at the seams, her face tearing open into black void. The farmhouse itself howled with her, every board, every nail vibrating in agony. Clara cried out once, not in fear but in defiance, and then there was light. A blinding, searing light that filled the attic, rushing outward through every corridor, flooding the orchard, spilling across the fields. When Edward's vision cleared, Bathilda was gone. The attic lay in silence, broken chalk scattered, candles extinguished. The farmhouse exhaled, as though relieved. The Whitakers sobbed below, clutching each other. For the first time in months, the house was still. But Clara lay motionless. Edward crawled to her side, shaking, calling her name over and over. Her face was peaceful, her hands folded loosely upon her chest, her lips still faintly curved into that small, knowing smile. He pressed his ear to her breast, begging for heartbeat, for breath, for anything. But she was gone. Clara had given herself to seal Bathilda away. The Whitakers left the house within days. They packed what little they owned into their car and did not look back. Neighbors whispered of them, said they would never speak of what they had seen. Edward buried Clara in consecrated ground, though he never remembered the prayers he spoke over her coffin. Afterward, he returned not to the farmhouse, never there, but to the small home he and Clara had built together, late years before they had ever set foot in Moreton-in-Marsh. Yet it was no longer a home. The rooms echoed with her absence. Her chair sat empty, her notebooks untouched on the shelf. He wandered from room to room, muttering her name as if it might draw her back. In the years that followed, Edward withered. He no longer worked, no longer lectured, no longer answered letters. He was sometimes seen in churchyards at dusk, staring at headstones as though waiting for a voice to answer him. Other times, villagers spotted him on the lane toward the farmhouse, standing at a distance, gazing at its blank windows, his face pale as if he could still hear Clara's voice inside. The farmhouse itself remained empty. Seasons passed. Grass grew wild in the orchard. The dry stone walls fell into ruin. Its windows darkened with mildew. Its beams sagged, yet still it stood. And though Bathilda Godfrey was bound, sealed in the silence Clara had wrought, the air around that house was never easy. Birds avoided the orchard. Children dared each other to touch its door, but none lingered. At night, when the wind moved through the oaks, some swore they heard a woman's voice, not screaming, not whispering, but singing, a lullaby. Edward died a decade later, his hair white, his frame stooped. Those who attended his funeral said he carried with him the look of a man who had never truly left that night in the attic. His last words, they said, were Clara's name. And so the farmhouse endures, standing watch over Moreton-in-Marsh. The villagers still do not speak its name, for they know the silence it holds is a silence bought with sacrifice. And somewhere, deep beneath its stones, Bathilda Godfrey waits. If you enjoy this video, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It truly helps us make more of this type of content.